Today I'm going to be continuing my discussion of how the newly formed United States uh, forms a plan of governance. Specifically, I'll be focusing on the drafting and ratification of the U.S. Constitution. When we left off last time, our delegates from the 13 states had met in Philadelphia in the spring of 1787 to discuss exactly how they would revise the Articles of Confederation. They realized very early on, if you remember, that in order to achieve this goal of a stronger, more centralized national government, it would be better to scrap the articles and create a new constitution from scratch. And we talked about how this represents a significant shift in power from a state-centered government to a federal-centered government. So we're giving the federal government more power. The state governments will end up becoming subordinate to this newly empowered federal government. And the specific powers we talked about were the power to regulate trade, levy taxes, raise an army, and print money. All of these things were specifically intended to address some of the challenges that the nation was facing at the time, and we talked about some of those in our last session. Once we decide to begin drafting a new constitution, creating a completely new system of government from scratch, one of the very first issues that comes up in the debate is the issue of representation. And this is kind of a big deal because all through the years leading up to the Revolution, the idea of representation was one of the central issues of the Patriot movement. They were frustrated about taxation, but not just the taxes. They were angry that they were not represented in Parliament. So this idea of representation is very important to everyone in Philadelphia at this Constitutional Convention. So this is one of the first big issues that they have to overcome is how exactly are the states going to be represented in this newly formed federal government. So right away, two plans emerge, the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan. And we can simplify this by saying it was basically the big states versus the small states. Virginia was a large state, large in territory, large in population, compared to New Jersey, which was relatively small in terms of both. So the big states versus the small states in terms of differing ideas on representation. Virginia suggested that representation in Congress should be based on population. The larger the state, the more people that you have in your state, the more votes that you get in Congress. New Jersey argued just the opposite, saying that if the big states are allowed more representation in Congress, then the issues concerning the little states will always be subordinate to those of the big states. So New Jersey proposes a representation schematic based on equality. Every state gets the same number of votes. However many votes that is determined to be, they are all going to be equal. So two competing ideas here, one based on population, one based on straight equality. Every state gets the same number of votes. And it's difficult for them to come to any kind of an agreement here because there's a lot of competing interests. Especially when you start looking at the how the various populations of these states are going to be determined. We'll get to that issue here in just a minute. So after much debate, we finally come to an agreement, a compromise, the Great Compromise. And this is important on a couple different levels. One, it solves the issue of representation in the immediate context, allowing the delegates to continue their work on drafting the Constitution, but it also sets a precedent for the future of how American politics will be conducted. And the idea of compromise is going to become a recurring theme in American politics. With differing groups having competing agendas. In the end, in order to get anything done, the two groups or the competing interests will have to reach some sort of compromise. Each side giving up a little bit of something in order to get something that they truly want. So this idea of compromise is going to become a recurring theme, and it begins here at the Constitutional Convention in the debate over representation. So in the end, when the dust settles on this, what they do is they decide to split Congress into two houses, a Senate and a House of Representatives, an upper house and a lower house. And in the Senate, representation of each state will be equal, 2 representatives or 2 senators per state. So it's equal in the Senate. In the House of Representatives, or the lower house, the representation is based on the population of that state. So the larger states will have more representatives in the House than the smaller states, but in the Senate, all states will be represented equally. And this serves another purpose too. The Senate, the upper house, will primarily represent the interests of the states themselves, whereas the House of Representatives will represent the interests of the people, the individual citizens. So, and that's why they chose to base it on population. Each state is represented equally in the Senate, and the people are represented in the House based on the population of each state. And this seemed to work out well for both parties, both sides. You know, the advocates of the Virginia plan and those of the New Jersey plan seemed to be satisfied with this. There were still some who were not completely satisfied, but you know, the nature of compromise is that everyone is going to give up a little something in order to get something that they want even more. So we reached an agreement. Representation is now decided, and how the states are going to be represented in Congress, and we're able to move on to other issues. But in order to get to those other issues, we had to resolve this issue of representation. It was probably the most central issue in this whole constitutional debate. A little footnote here for you. Representatives in the House of Representatives are elected by popular vote. The people, voters, will elect these representatives, but members of the Senate will be chosen by the state governments. So there's no direct election of senators at this time. Now that'll change later on in the 20th century, of course, well beyond the scope of this class. But later on, the senators will be chosen by popular vote as well. But in the early years of our republic, senators are chosen by the state governments. Members of the House are elected by the people. So once we decide on how the states are going to be represented, the next issue, and it's kind of an extension of representation, is how exactly will we determine the population of these states? Some states want slaves to be considered part of the population in order to calculate their number of representatives in the House. Of course, obviously, these are the southern states where there's large numbers of slaves. They want to count those slaves for the purpose of representation. Northern states, of course, will oppose this based on the fact that there are so few slaves in the North. They're not really, even if they did count them as part of the population, it's not going to make any difference. But if we decide to count slaves as part of the population for the issue of representation, then it's going to give all of the southern states an unfair advantage in the House of Representatives. So they reached this what's known as the 3/5 compromise, and this is one of the more bizarre stories in American history. In order to make peace with all 13 states, in order to get the northern states and the southern states to finally agree on how this is going to work, it was decided to count 3/5 of the slave population for the purpose of representation. This gives the South a chance to count some of their slaves as population, but not all of them. And there was also a tax angle here too. The 3/5 of the slave population would also be used to calculate the direct tax that states would pay to the federal government. So this 3/5 compromise, 3/5 of the slave population will be used for the purposes of representation in Congress. And it's at this point where we can see that this debate over how slavery will factor into the issue of representation. This, in a way, plants the seeds of the Civil War, because throughout the next 100 years or so, or I guess not 100 years, but throughout the next about 80 years, up to the beginning of the Civil War, this issue of representation in Congress is going to be one of the big issues that divides North and South. Which side of the country is more represented in Congress? Are there more northern states or more free states than there are slave states? And if so, will those states have more of a voice in Congress than the opposite section? So the division of the country between North and South becomes very much a political issue. Slavery at this point is not really a moral issue. There are a few groups in the North, chief among them the Quakers, who at this point had already condemned slavery and abolished slavery within their own communities. But slavery still exists in all of the northern states during this time period. And while it's on a very small scale, it still exists. But no one's really debating slavery as a moral issue at this point. It's strictly a political issue, and specifically with regards to representation. Which section of the country, the North or the South, is going to have a stronger voice in Congress? And we're talking about mainly the Senate here. If there's more slave states than there are free states, then there will be more senators from the South than there are from the North. So within the Senate, there will be a disproportionate representation for the South. Southern interests will have an advantage over Northern interests. So it becomes very important, almost obsessive, to the two sections of the country to maintain this equal balance between free states and slave states within the Senate, in order to give no side an advantage over the other. So one of the issues that will contribute to the Civil War, it's not the only issue, obviously, but one of the many issues that are going to contribute to the Civil War is being debated right here in the very beginning with this 3/5 compromise and the issue of representation. So while no one from the North and South is talking about Civil War at this point, it's still 80 years away, the seeds are being planted. Some of those issues are going to continue to grow and fester for many years until it eventually contributes to a Civil War. So once the issue of representation is finally settled, how the states are going to be represented in Congress, who is going to count as population for the issue, and when factoring a number of representatives, once that's settled, we can now move on to deciding the particulars of the Constitution. What branches of government are going to have what types of powers, and how those powers are going to be balanced among the three branches. So all the fine details now are being considered. What they end up coming up with is 3 branches of government. This will reflect the types of government we see at all the 13 states at this point. If you remember, back during the Revolution, each of the colonial governments reformed themselves as state governments, and they included a governor, a legislature, and a court system. So an executive, a legislative, and a judicial branch of government. We're going to create this new federal government in the image of the state governments. It's going to have the same 3 pieces, an executive, a legislative, and a judicial. So just to keep everything simple and systematic, the federal government will be structured exactly like the state governments. So we have a bicameral legislature. We just talked about that, a House of Representatives and a Senate, a lower house and an upper house. And this legislature will make the law. So Congress, their primary function is to make laws. That's their bread and butter. That's their primary function, is to make the laws. The office of the president is going to be a new piece of our federal government. Under the Articles of Confederation, there was no president. There was no chief executive, no executive at all. We're going to create one, this office of the president. He will be the chief executive. His primary function is to administer or execute the law, hence the term executive. Now, does that mean the president himself is going to be out conducting law enforcement? Obviously not. But there will be, within the executive branch, there will be other cabinets and departments that they'll be tasked with or delegated with individual responsibilities concerning executing the law or administering the law. Things like foreign relations and treaties, anything like that is going to be falling into this category as well. The president will also serve as commander-in-chief of the armed forces. albeit the armed forces are very small at this point. If in time of war, we call up the militia and activate the military, the president will serve as commander-in-chief of the military. And finally, our third piece, which also did not exist at the federal level previously, is a federal court system. And this is going to be broken down into a system of federal district courts and a U.S. Supreme Court. So there's two levels of courts here. And basically there'll be a federal district court, one in each of the 13 states, so that if there's any disputes under the law regarding the Constitution, a federal district court can hear those disputes, and if they can't decide it, then it will go on up to the one U.S. Supreme Court. And again, the primary function of the court system is to settle disputes under the law. So if there's ever some kind of a dispute regarding the Constitution, the Supreme Court or the federal court will be the final say in settling that dispute. While the Constitution does not originally specify this, the act of settling a dispute under the law with regards to the Constitution is going to inherently lead to the Supreme Court assuming the duty of interpreting the Constitution, deciding what is consistent with the Constitution, what is inconsistent with the Constitution in terms of new laws and regulations. So by settling a dispute under the law, the Supreme Court will inadvertently assume the duty of interpreting the law. So as far as when the Constitution is unclear on a specific point, the Supreme Court will have the final word in interpreting that piece of the Constitution, and that'll be more firmly established later on with some Supreme Court cases, and we'll talk about that in the coming weeks. But so just to recap here, the legislative branch, Congress, they make the law. The office of the president, he executes the law or administers the law. And the federal court system settles disputes under the law, or they interpret the law. So three distinctly different branches, each with distinctly different powers. And this was intentional. And this harkens back to the Enlightenment and John Locke's contract theory of government, specifically with republicanism, and how the powers of a government should be separated into multiple branches. And we remember our first example of this was during the Glorious Revolution, the English Bill of Rights, when Parliament decided to share power with the king, and separate those ruling powers between the monarchy and Parliament. Here we have the American example of that Enlightenment ideal, where powers of government are separated among three branches so that no one group or individual has all the power. And when we talk about these powers outlined in the Constitution, we can see that the Constitution itself specifies several powers that belong to the federal government. The federal government now has the power to tax, the power to raise an army, the power to regulate trade. So these specific powers outlined by the Constitution as federal powers, they don't specify any state powers, but it is implied that anything not specified by the Constitution as a federal power will become the powers retained by the state governments. Now, in the beginning, this is just the state power is just implied, but we'll see here in a little bit how some people will advocate for provisions in the Constitution to specify this in writing. So we have specified federal powers and implied state powers. Just to kind of run down checks and balances here, how these three branches of the federal government we've talked about how powers have been distributed among them, but it'll help us understand this if we can look at a couple of examples. Just for example here, we talk about checks and balances, how each of these three branches will check the power of the other two branches to prevent one branch from becoming more powerful than the others. When we look at say the Congress has the power to make the laws, But that doesn't mean they can just make any law that they feel like it. That power to make laws is checked by the president, who has the power to veto any bill that Congress puts forth. So Congress passes a law, the president can veto it if he doesn't agree that that law is going to be constitutional or good for the nation. And to check the power of these two branches, the Supreme Court can weigh in on any disputes. If this law is passed, Congress passes a law, the president signs off on it. Later on, it becomes an issue of controversy. It ends up in the court system. The Supreme Court can then rule that that law is unconstitutional, which basically strikes the law down, checking the power of the president and Congress. Another example is that the Supreme Court justices can only be appointed by the president. The president's the only one with the power to appoint Supreme Court justices, so he kind of has power over the court system. But to check the president's power, the Senate must approve all of these executive appointments. So while the president can appoint anyone he wants to, the Senate must approve of those appointments. So again, here we have one branch checking the power of the others, and so on and so forth. The executive branch is responsible for foreign relations, signing treaties, and so forth. But again, the Senate must approve or ratify those treaties. The president can't just sign. He can sign whatever treaty he wants to, but in order for it to become binding to the United States, the Senate must ratify that treaty. Congress can declare war, but only the president can serve as commander-in-chief. So again, here even the power of the military is broken down into two branches. So these are just some examples of how some of these powers are distributed among the branches. And just to do a hypothetical example for you here, let's say that Congress wants to pass a law making it a criminal act to wear socks with sandals. And it seems kind of silly, but it's just a simple way to illustrate how this process works. Congress passes a law saying that it is now a crime to wear socks with sandals. The president disagrees with this law. The president says, okay, I think that law is ridiculous, it's absurd, I'm not going to sign it. The president will veto this no socks with sandals law. So then it's not a dead issue at that point. Although the president checked the power of Congress here, Congress can overturn the president's veto with a 2/3 majority vote in both houses, both the Senate and the House of Representatives. So even though the president vetoed it, Congress can still pass that law, but it becomes more difficult to get a 2/3 majority vote than it is a simple majority. And once this, let's say the no socks with sandal becomes law, what will happen then is that eventually someone will get arrested for wearing socks with sandals, and they'll go to court over this, and they will sue as it's a violation of their First Amendment rights, and the Supreme Court will weigh in on this case and say that yes, okay, this law that prohibits wearing socks with sandals is in fact a violation of the First Amendment, so the court will strike down the law. So the law will either have to be revised or abandoned. So here we have kind of a simple example of how the three branches of government will check each other's power. And this is the process. This is designed on purpose to prevent any one branch of the government from obtaining too much power. The president cannot rule arbitrarily. In fact, he can't even make any laws. Only Congress can make the law. A president can issue executive orders, and it's whatever he wants it to be. The president can write an executive order, but in order for that executive order to be put into effect, it has to be funded. It's going to require money to administer that piece of law, that executive order. Congress controls the budget. So if Congress disapproves of the president's executive order, they can just refuse to fund or provide any funding for that law, and then that executive order just becomes a piece of paper on the president's desk with no real power. Or the Supreme Court can rule the president's executive order unconstitutional. Again, we see here that the system is designed to prevent any one person or group from obtaining too much power. So once the Constitution is all ironed out. And it's not a very long document. If you've ever read the Constitution, it's a relatively simple document. It's not that long in its original form. And it once they get it, it takes them about a year or so to get the Constitution ironed out the way they want it. And Congress, members of Congress, they all sign off on it, and this is what we agreed to. This is our proposal. But at this point, the Constitution, even though it's finished, it's written out, it's all written down, it's signed by the members of Congress, it is not the official law of the land yet. It is, at this point, it is simply a proposal. In order for the Constitution to become the law of the land, it must be ratified by at least 9 out of the 13 states. And this was part of the this was a requirement under the Articles of Confederation. Under the Articles of Confederation, a 2/3 majority vote was required in order to change the articles, to revise them in some way. So any new laws that are going to come out of Congress under the Articles of Confederation need this 2/3 majority vote, or 9 out of the 13 states. So since this Constitution is a new law, it must be ratified by 9 out of the 13 state governments. So once they finish writing the Constitution, they make 13 copies of it, and they send a copy to each of the state governments. And the state governments themselves will debate whether or not they're going to support this Constitution. So in the Virginia state government, they are debating this. In the New York state government and Massachusetts and South Carolina and so on, each of the individual 13 states are debating whether or not to ratify this Constitution. That in that process of the state governments debating this, we see 2 groups of people emerge. Those who support or strongly support the Constitution and a strong central government, calling themselves Federalists. Of course, the name is obvious. They are supporting a federal system of government, so they call themselves Federalists. And then on the opposite side of the aisle is a group who are opposed to the strong federal government, and they call themselves the Anti-Federalists. Now, it's important to note here that despite their name, their name sounds kind of negative, Anti-Federalist. But it's not that they were so opposed to the Constitution outright. They had a lot of concerns over whether or not this newly empowered federal government would be able to resist abusing its power, and they were concerned about the rights of the states, or the rights of the individual citizens, being abused by a powerful central government. So they had a lot of reservations about this Constitution, specifically with the amount of power that it gave to this new federal government. So a debate ensues in each of the state governments over whether or not this Constitution should become the law of the land. A debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. A little footnote for you here. These 2 groups will eventually form the basis of our political parties that will emerge during the first administration of George Washington. So in a few years from now, these 2 groups will kind of morph into political parties, but right now they are just supporters of and opponents of the Constitution. In an attempt to win support for the Constitution, the Federalists are going to publish a series of essays called the Federalist Papers. And this is in 1788, the year that we are trying to get the Constitution ratified. So it's being debated in all the state governments, and there's several people who are going to pen these essays, but chief among them are Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison. Particularly James Madison is going to be compelling in his argument in support of the Constitution. So these essays will be circulated and distributed to the state governments as well. Again, arguing the benefits of a strong federal government. They argued that the power of the federal government will be the best chance of ensuring the rights of the people, because if without some sort of organization and order at the center, there's the chance of chaos pulling the nation in many different directions. 13 different states all pulling in 13 different directions. The future of the nation could possibly be in jeopardy, and a strong central government would help to prevent that sort of constant pulling in all those different directions. This was one of the big arguments that was made by Madison, Jay, and Hamilton. And just FYI, all three of these men will go on to hold prominent positions in the federal government during George Washington's administration. Hamilton will become Washington's Secretary of Treasury. John Jay will eventually be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. James Madison will, some years later, become President of the United States. So each of these men will come back to play a role in our story later on. So the Anti-Federalists published a similar series of essays, again, not just condemning the Constitution outright, but arguing that caution is warranted here. If we give this federal government all these new powers, there is a potential danger for it to abuse that power and restrict the rights of the people. So the Anti-Federalists are issuing a cautionary warning. We need to be careful how we proceed here, because this government has a potential to abuse its power, just like our situation with England. England, a strong, powerful central government in London, abused its power from the colonial perspective, and a lot of the rights of the people were infringed upon by that powerful central government. So the Anti-Federalists are anxious to avoid that type of situation. So they are arguing caution here. In the end, the Federalists will win enough support for the Constitution, and it will be ratified in 1788. What ends up happening is that I gave you two dates here. Ratification of the Constitution. I gave you two dates: 1788 and 1790. In 1788, the 9th out of the 13 states ratified the Constitution, and it became the law of the land. So in 1788, they achieved the minimum, 9 out of 13 states ratification. So the Constitution officially becomes the law of the land in 1788. But it's not until 1790 that the last few states ratified the Constitution. All 13 states will have ratified it by 1790. So that's why I give you two dates here. One is when it becomes the law of the land, and the second date is when the last of the 13 states ratified it. One of the reasons why the Anti-Federalists were able to put their support behind ratification was an agreement, and this was kind of an unwritten agreement, just kind of they wanted some sort of guaranteed protection of the people's rights. And if you remember when we talked earlier in this week, how the state governments, the individual state governments, within their constitutions, there was a Bill of Rights, a specific protection of the rights of the people in that state. Well, the Anti-Federalists argued that, okay, if we're going to support this Constitution, if we're going to support a strong central government, giving this government a lot of powers, or we're going to subordinate the states to this federal government, we want specific guarantees of the people's rights. We want a Bill of Rights. So it was agreed upon that if the Constitution becomes ratified, then Congress will set about the task of including a Bill of Rights in the Constitution. And so in 1791, the year, well, just shortly after the Constitution was ratified by all the states, one of the first acts of Congress was to draft a Bill of Rights, which became our first 10 amendments. And we'll take a look at some of those here in just a second. Here, of course, we're looking at an illustration. Congress signing the Constitution. It is completed at this point and now being submitted to the states for ratification. This illustration appeared in a newspaper at the time, which was covering the Constitutional Convention and this issue of ratification. Newspapers at the time were the go-to source of news and information for the public. Whereas today we've got all the popular media websites and news outlets. In the 1780s, the newspaper was the primary source of information. So the newspapers were following this ratification process very closely. Local newspapers and state newspapers were really interested in this. This is kind of a big deal because if it's ratified, this new Constitution will change everything. It will be a completely new form of government, or new system of government. And so everyone is interested in this. This wasn't something that was just taking place in Independence Hall in Philadelphia or in the individual houses of government in each state. This was something that was being debated openly in public. Everyone was aware of this. And the newspapers were helping keep the public informed as to how this process was unfolding. This illustration was part of a series of illustrations that were all very similar, with these individual pillars representing the 13 states. And this particular illustration has represented the ninth state, which was New Hampshire, to ratify the Constitution, thus making it the law of the land. And of course, there's a quote basically from the Constitutional Convention. Basically, the ratification of the Constitution of 9 states shall be sufficient for the establishment of this Constitution. So this is important. It's at this point that the Constitution becomes the law of the land. And as this newspaper is saying that if it's not up, referring to the last few pillars representing the last few states, then it will rise. The attraction must be irresistible. So the fact that the Constitution is now the law of the land, with 9 out of 13 states having ratified it, this will provide an additional motivation or attraction for these remaining states to go ahead and ratify it. So that's just kind of illustrated by this graphic here. But the point I'm trying to make is that this was a big event. It wasn't just something that was taking place in the halls of government. This was something that the public was very aware of and very interested in following, because it was going to affect everyone's life and it's going to change everything. So everyone was following the story very closely. All right, let's talk a little bit about our Bill of Rights. These first 10 amendments. When they said they wanted specific protections of individuals' rights, the Federalists responded by saying, the existence of the Constitution will protect everyone's rights. A stable central government or a strong central government will have a stabilizing effect on the nation, which will end up protecting everyone's rights. The fact that we've distributed power among these 3 branches and provided for checks and balances, this will help prevent the government from abusing the people's rights. But the Anti-Federalists argued back that, okay, we see your point, and we understand how that works, but we want it in writing. We want specific protections for the people's rights in writing in the Constitution. So the Federalists agreed, and this one of the first acts of Congress was to write this Bill of Rights. Now, I've chosen this particular graphic. It's kind of an oversimplification of the Bill of Rights. I've chosen on purpose because it's kind of a cheat sheet. It's an easy way to remember what each of the first 10 amendments, or this Bill of Rights, entails. And some of these will undoubtedly be very familiar to you. Others you probably haven't ever heard of before. I'm not going to go through all 10 amendments, but I will cover some of the highlights, especially the ones that are going to be relevant to our discussions this semester as the nation continues to grow and expand. First Amendment, one everyone's familiar with, freedom of speech, religion, the press, assembly, and one that people often forget about is the right to petition the government. And this is an important part of the First Amendment. You remember all the trouble that the colonial governments went through when they were trying to convince England to give them representation in Parliament. They signed these petitions. Remember our declarations of grievances, and sent those to Parliament. Parliament ignored those. So we want specific protection of the people's right to petition the government. And so this is important. And of course, freedom of assembly. This harkens back to the Boston Massacre. We want to be able to assemble and protest and petition the government without fear of physical reprisals. So a lot of the things in the First Amendment specifically address issues that they had with the previous government of England. Right to bear arms. Today is kind of a hot button issue, but in the 1790s, it was not really much of a controversy. The reason, or the backstory of the Second Amendment, in the early republic, just like it was in colonial times, the national defense was provided for by the state militias. So as far as defending America against an invasion or defending against anything, the militia was our primary form of defense. We didn't keep a large standing army. It was different than it is today. Today we've got a Department of Defense, one of the largest military forces in the world, and it's a permanent fixture. Our permanent standing military is part of our life today. That didn't exist in the 1790s. We relied almost exclusively on the militia. So these citizen soldiers, people who were, they had everyday lives, they did something else, some of the profession, and only in time of war were they activated into a military. So in order for the militia system to work, the people must have their own weapons. So you're a citizen soldier. You're just a clerk or a merchant or a farmer. But in time of war, you're going to be expected to report for duty and serve as a soldier. In order for that to happen, you have to have your own weapon. So the right to bear arms was an integral part of our national defense during this time. It seemed like an obvious right. We can't, if we're going to rely on militia instead of a standing army, then the people are going to need to have weapons. So this was the thinking at the time. It won't become controversial till later on in the 20th century when America finally decides to keep a large standing army as opposed to a militia. And some people will begin arguing in the mid 20th century that is the Second Amendment still relevant? Being the fact that we have a large standing army now, we no longer have real need for militia. Is this really necessary? That's where the argument begins, is in the mid 20th century as we change our pattern of defense. And other issues were introduced later on, other arguments, and of course an attempt to settle the gun debate definitively here is way beyond the scope of this class. But it's important that we understand the origins of this amendment and what the thinking was behind it. Our Third Amendment prohibits the quartering of soldiers in citizens' homes, and this is an obvious connection to some of the issues we had with England prior to the Revolution, the Quartering Act, and so forth. We want a specific reference in the Constitution prohibiting that to ensure that kind of problem never happens again. The Fourth Amendment through the Eighth Amendment, all of these concern rights of people accused of crimes and trial proceedings and so forth and so on. And these are all tied closely to, if you remember our earlier discussions about the Vice Admiralty courts and the writs of assistance and how those seemed unduly arbitrary and abusive. We have specific provisions here, the Fourth to the Eighth Amendments, specifying what your rights are if you're accused of crimes, if you're on trial for a crime, how the jury functions, jury of your peers in deciding your fate, and so on and so forth, how your property will be searched, what rights you have regarding that. Again, all of these things regard to legal proceedings. We're not going to really, a lot of these are not going to be relevant to our course this semester, except for the Fifth Amendment. One part of the Fifth Amendment that is people are not usually familiar with is the protection of private property. It's the last piece of the Fifth Amendment, basically saying that citizens will not be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Private property shall not be taken for public use without just compensation. So this is the last part of the Fifth Amendment regarding private property. This is going to be one of the arguments that Southerners will use later on as we get into the 19th century and we see an abolitionist movement start to coalesce and the institution of slavery comes under attack. This will be one of the ways that Southerners will defend the institution, is saying that slaves are property, and the Fifth Amendment protects the private property of citizens. So if the federal government tries to pass a law abolishing slavery, that would be unconstitutional because technically they'd be seizing private property without due process of law, a violation of their Fifth Amendment rights. So this will be we'll talk about that as we get into the debate over slavery later on in the semester. This will come up again. So you put a pin in this and keep this handy in your notes because we'll be referring to that again. The 10th Amendment is also going to be another important one that's going to affect our story this semester. And this one is probably, of all the amendments, this one was probably one of the most important in terms of the state governments. Basically, this clarifies or specifies that any powers that are not specifically designated as federal powers are to be reserved for the states. So basically, anything not covered in the Constitution as a federal power is automatically becomes the jurisdiction of the state governments. And this is going to be another important one, this 10th Amendment, the States' Rights Amendment as it's nicknamed. This will be another big argument as we get further on in our story and we see divisions between North and South, and particularly divisions, debates between the powers of the federal government and the powers of the state government. Basically anything that's not specified in the Constitution as a federal power automatically becomes the right of the states. One of those things is the institution of slavery. In the Constitution, there's no mention of slavery as far as its legal status in the United States. It doesn't say it's legal, it doesn't say it's illegal. The Constitution does not address the institution of slavery. So Southern states will argue that since the Constitution does not address it, then it is up to the state governments. The individual state governments can decide for themselves whether slavery is going to be legal or illegal. And so this will be another big argument that the Southern states will use to defend slavery. And we'll talk about this more as the issue comes up and is debated over the next few years in Congress. But this should just give you an idea of the importance that a lot of people placed on specifying protections of these rights. The Constitution is not specific on a lot of points. There's a lot of gray area in the Constitution. And some have argued that this is the genius of the Constitution. The fact that it's not so specific. It can be interpreted, it gives it flexibility. It makes it adaptable to a society that is continuing to grow and change. Even today, our society is still going through the process of change and growth, and the Constitution is still relevant because so little is specified. It gives flexibility. Other people have argued that this is a weakness of the Constitution. The fact that the Constitution did not specify things early on led to a lot of the changes and social and political turmoil that the nation has experienced over the course of its existence. So both arguments can be made about this lack of specificity in the Constitution. But for better or worse, the Constitution has been kind of a guiding principle, a handrail, so to speak, for the nation throughout all of its life. Even today, it still serves as the foundation for everything that goes on in the nation. Its longevity is the best testament to its genius. The fact that it has survived and continues to function, and our nation continues to use the Constitution as its primary guide for making laws, that is a testament to its quality, to its usefulness. At any rate, the reason we talk about the Constitution in this class is because over the course of the next few weeks, as we see new laws being passed and the nation going through various changes and political issues will come up, particularly as they lead us to the Civil War, it's important that you remember some of these aspects of the Constitution, because a lot of what we talk about in the coming weeks won't make much sense if you're not at least generally familiar with the Constitution. So you save your notes on the Constitution, because you'll need to refer to them again as we go on in order to understand some of those issues as they come up. That's all we have time for today. Again, our purpose today was to just get our minds around a general understanding of the Constitution, how it functions and what its intended purpose was, and of course the role that it's going to play in the growth and development of our early republic in these first few years that our nation is independent. Until next time, take care.